Welcome to a new lecture and to our last lecture on EU-Russian relations, and today we are going to speak about a very controversial issue, the issue of the future of EU-Russian relations. The future is particularly obscure in today's times, but let's see what the situation is. Well, but we basically have to start not from the moment of today, but from a bit before, because we actually started speaking about current trends and future trends much earlier, somewhere at the beginning of this century, when Russia argued that Russia changed, the European Union changed, the whole environment changed, and therefore there was a need to reassess the goals and the institutions and the procedures and to adopt something new. And two sort of like ways were identified in that respect. The first way was to modernize the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, and the second one was to conclude the Partnership for Modernization. So let's look at the Partnership for Modernization first, because it got its success much before the new agreement, and the new agreement, well, we will look at it, but it's still being negotiated. So anyways, what is modernization? It's actually a very tricky issue, because Russia and the European Union do have quite some argument about what is modernization, but even the position of Russia is quite ambiguous. Russia mentioned modernization for the first time in its Russian foreign policy concept, and in parallel in the very famous article of Mr. Medvedev, Russia Go Ahead, Россия Вперед. So the foreign policy concept of Russia, one approved in 2008 in connection with the arrival of Mr. Medvedev to the Kremlin, argued that modernization was about the transformation of the economy, first and foremost, more specifically along innovation lines, enhancing the living standards, consolidation of the civils of society, and then at the same time it was about strengthening of the foundations of the constitutional system, rule of law and democratic institutions. And so it was about economics and politics, but note that it's not about the transformation of the political system, rather it's about the strengthening of the mechanisms that were already in place. A dialogue between Russia and Germany on modernization was launched already in 2008, and then Russia further clarified its vision of modernization. So in the article that I already mentioned, the article of Mr. Medvedev, it was mainly about economic modernization. It was mainly about a departure from the resource-based economy towards competitive production, development of new technologies, and construction of economy based on the needs of individuals. And the article even identified 5 locomotives for the modernization: energy efficiency, nuclear energy, information technologies, space technologies, and certain medical technologies. But the article also mentioned political modernization, saying that economic modernization is a necessary precondition for the political modernization, and that political modernization will follow economic modernization. So that was the vision of Russia. The EU's vision was slightly different. Although modernization as a concept appeared in the 1950s and 1960s to denote transformations in non-Western countries, and it contrasted with modernization, with Westernization in a sense, the EU argued that modernization was first and foremost about political reforms, about the rule of law, about the reform of the judicial system, and about democracy and human rights. The argument of the European Union was that these changes would create preconditions for real economic reforms. And that was in line with the EU's normative leadership and with the EU's vision for the world at the time. What is important for Russia, and what probably was underestimated in the European Union, was that in terms of economic modernization, Russia was treated as an equal partner. Whereas in terms of political modernization, it was emphasized that Russia still had to go a long way before it achieved the results that were in place in the European Union. Eventually, Russia and the European Union agreed on the Partnership for Modernization at their summit in the Rostov-on-Don. And here are the priorities that were identified. Investment, trade and economic relations, support for small and medium enterprises, approximation of technical standards, development of transport and sustainable low-carbon economy, energy efficiency, cooperation, innovation, research and development, and addressing the consequences of the market economy. But the partnership also talked about the independence of judiciary and fight against corruption, and about the dialogue of the civil society. So the partnership was mainly about economics, but it did mention some political aspects of modernization, but political aspects which were acceptable for Russia in terms of corruption, that is considered a problem in Russia, and in terms of the dialogue of the civil society. The Partnership for Modernization was therefore launched, and it further developed in two different ways. Firstly, at the EU's level, sectoral dialogues, which were particularly important for the Partnership for Modernization, were identified. Remember that those sectoral dialogues were set up as a result of the common spaces between Russia and the European Union, mostly common economic space. So this is the list of the dialogues which were identified as crucial for the Partnership for Modernization, ranging from energy to financial policy, from customs to science. At the same time, and in parallel, Russia concluded bilateral partnerships for modernization with virtually all member states of the European Union, with the exception of Greece, Estonia, Malta and Croatia. These partnerships were predominantly economic, although some of them had a political section as well, and that political section in fact differs from one country to another country. The Partnership for Modernization was gradually reviewed by Russia and the European Union. Russia was particularly keen on the Partnership for Modernization and looked after progress reports. The last progress report was published in January 2014, and since that time the dialogue, the partnership has been frozen due to the overall crisis in EU-Russian relations. Now let's look at the future agreement between the European Union and Russia. Well, in fact, from the very beginning, the rhetoric of Russia and the European Union on the future agreement was different. The European Union argued that the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement created an adequate set of instruments and mechanisms, and therefore these mechanisms had to be used. The European Union also argued that the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement laid the necessary basis for cooperation, and we just have to fill it with the content. And it's in line with the logics of sort of like structured financial foreign relations and refondation, a revision of EU-Russian relations had to come later according to the point of the European Union. However, Russia argued that it established itself as democracy, as a market economy, that the EU also progressed a long way since the beginning of the 1990s in terms of the economic integration, in terms of the political integration, in terms of the enlargement. Russia also referred to the midterm strategy that already at the turn of the century mentioned the need for a new agreement that would grant more equality to Russia, but that would also take into account all the developments that have taken place. And of course, Russia referred to the 2007 deadline, because remember that the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement was concluded for the initial period of 10 years, which is then extended every year. So because the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement entered into force in 1997, 2007 was a convenient pretext to review EU-Russian relations. It is, however, important to say that in 2007, no deadline was looming, in the sense that the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement didn't cease to exist. It's just like as of 2007, it is automatically extended, provided that no party declares that it doesn't want to extend it, at least 6 months before the expiration of the agreement. Because the agreement entered into force on the 1st of December 1997, the point of no return is every year on the 1st of June. And of course the parties have kept that agreement because nobody wants to find itself in the legal vacuum, irrespective of how much they like or dislike the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. However, in October 2005, the European Union agreed with Russia, and they decided to launch a discussion on the new agreement. They had to prepare the guidelines for the next summit, but actually the negotiations didn't start until quite a long period of time. So there was a long reflection period both in Russia and the European Union, but there was also a very pronounced controversy among member states of the European Union in terms of the mandate for cooperation with Russia, but also in terms of the timing of cooperation with some new member states, mainly Poland and Lithuania, abusing their position of membership, trying to solve some of the national issues with Russia, issues of bilateral relations with Russia, and sort of like uploading those issues to the EU's level, hence blocking the start of cooperation, the start of negotiations on a new agreement. However, let's look at the visions that existed on both sides. For the European Union, the future of the relations was an issue mostly because of the institutional setup, because of the need to clarify who is involved, who is not involved. But it was not about the change of EU-Russian institutions or about a substantial change in terms of the substance of cooperation. For Russia, the issue was more conceptual and more important because, first of all, the future of the relations for Russia was because of the very concept of cooperation. Russia wanted to sort out the issue of whether it would be a sectoral cooperation, so just like a few sectors, or whether it would be something that we can call wholesale cooperation, sort of like involving all parts of the economy. Russia wanted to clarify whether inequality in terms of Russia aligning its legislation to that of the European Union would be preserved, or whether there would be more equality. Russia wanted to change institutions so as for them to reflect the importance of Russia and the growing assertiveness of Russia. And therefore, the mandates or the guidelines that the parties prepared were completely different. For the European Union, the mandate was prepared in July 2006. It was about the overall agreement, including the maximum number of provisions, particularly those that were related to energy. The European Union learned its lesson in terms of Russia's non-ratification of the Energy Charter Treaty and wanted to avoid that by all means. Secondly, it was about the interaction of different EU institutions, so which institutions would have a say and how they would sort of develop a single position. For the European Union, the issue was also about political conditionality, about the respect for human rights, democracy and the rule of law. And of course, the agreement had to be mixed in terms of involving both competences of the European Union and competences of member states. And that, of course, meant that the ratification of then 25 and soon to be 27 and 28 member states would be quite a protracted affair. Russia, for its part, wanted to have a very short and concise core agreement, supplemented with different protocols and different sectors of cooperation. And in that sense, Russia wanted to have more flexibility in terms of choosing where to cooperate and where not to cooperate. What the parties agreed upon, however, was that they definitely wanted a binding agreement, that they were not ready to just have a declaration. And in that sense, that sort of like reflected a certain lack of trust between the European Union and Russia. At the same time, they agreed that they didn't want to make it more complicated and too difficult to coordinate. They wanted to have an update on the WTO, on the security and defense cooperation, on cooperation in the world arena, on enlargement, on terrorism, on all sorts of issues. And they definitely wanted to improve some institutional provisions, decrease the number of summits, because both parties realized that 2 summits a year were too much to deliver results. Well, now we don't have any summit and EU-Russian relations survive, but that's a different issue. Russia and the European Union wanted to have more low-level transgovernmental interaction in terms of the dialogues, or maybe some working groups. And Russia, in theory, wanted to have an EU-Russian Council modeled after its relations with the NATO, or after the relations between the European Union and the NATO, so that everybody would be present at the table, every member state of the European Union plus Russia, so that Russia could sort of like address individual member states. The European Union believed that that was too risky in terms of the internal consensus and was not prepared to go alone. The decision to launch the negotiations was taken in November 2006, but as I already mentioned, Poland, Lithuania and Estonia blocked the process, so eventually negotiations started in June 2008. They were temporarily suspended as a result of the Russian-Georgian war, and they were restarted in 2008. The 13 rounds took place between Russia and the European Union, and the parties actually diverged on how much was agreed, with the European Union saying that about 80% of the provisions were clarified, and with Russia saying that yes, quite a lot of provisions were clarified, but at the same time the most important and the most controversial in terms of the structure and the substance of cooperation were not discussed, precisely because of the difficulties. And moreover, Russian negotiators would say that there was no progress at sight in terms of those points of confrontation. In any case, the parties initially developed a pattern of cooperation that allowed them to talk first about issues that they agreed upon, and then to move to controversial issues. And that allowed to sort of like accumulate a very positive background, a very positive foundation for further cooperation on difficult issues. However, discussions on future agreements were frozen in March 2014, and they have not been restarted yet. Still, we can speak about some points of confrontation between Russia and the European Union. Firstly, there is definitely a crisis of strategic vision on the part of both Russia and the European Union, in the sense that everybody understands that they need to cooperate, but nobody sees what will be the final goal of this cooperation. There's a confrontation between Russia and the European Union in terms of how to define Europe, whether it's about historical heritage, geographical territory, or common values. And of course, the values definition challenges, in a way, Russia's European identity, Russian European credentials, and that is not liked in Moscow. Moscow wants to guarantee equality by all means, and it's not quite clear how to do that. The economic pragmatism of Russia clearly faces the EU's normative power, the wish to bring in some political conditionality. It's not clear how detailed the agreement should be, whether it should embrace all fields of cooperation, or whether it should be, like Russia argued, a core agreement, a small agreement, amended with different protocols. There is a disagreement on legal approximation, on the sort of like modalities of legal approximation, on the efforts of Russia to guarantee its equality, and on the natural propensity of the European Union to export its legislation on the other hand. There's a clear conflict, and it's not quite obvious how to solve that conflict. The parties still have to debate modalities of political and security cooperation, whether it will include mostly external security, or whether it will take into consideration also internal security. They still have to define modalities of economic cooperation. The parties agree that they need a free trade area, but they don't agree about the type of free trade area that they would like to have. Russia wants to have a simplistic free trade area, which basically repeats the provisions of its membership in the WTO. The European Union wants to go further, saying that a simplistic free trade area doesn't bring any change to EU-Russian relations. There is a question of common neighborhood and Russia's integration project, so which competes with the European neighborhood policy, and it's not quite clear how to take Eurasian economic integration into consideration in the context of EU-Russian relations. And then, of course, there is this issue of bilateral versus multilateral, which emerges on the EU side in terms of Russia dealing with individual member states and Russia dealing with the European Union, and on the Russian side in terms of the European Union dealing with Russia, but also recognizing the Eurasian Economic Union, which includes more member states. So all these issues seem to be quite difficult to resolve, and they will definitely present problems for Russia and the European Union when they restart their negotiations on a future agreement sometime in the future, sometime when the crisis is behind, the current crisis is behind. What about the midterm future? Well, in terms of the midterm future, the European Union is driven by its 5 principles. The European Union demands that Russia respects the Minsk agreements first, that the European Union takes into consideration relations with former Soviet countries and protects their free choice of cooperation with external partners. The third one is about the EU's resilience to Russian threats. The fourth one is about selective engagement with Russia wherever it is possible and wherever it is acceptable for both sides. And the last point is about civil society and people-to-people contacts. So that's the EU's vision. Well, Russia adheres to a pragmatic position, saying that we are ready to cooperate whenever you are ready, but we're not going to take a proactive position, and we will just wait for you to change the position because we didn't introduce sanctions, and we're not going to bend under your threats. It's up to you to change the policy. But Russia is clearly willing, even if it doesn't state officially, to review its relations with the West. In terms of the midterm future, however, we will see more competition in the shared neighborhood area. We will also have the question of overall security that either brings into consideration Russian priorities of security that includes Russia or relies on the securitization of the Russian agenda that is currently in place in the European Union. We will have trade and energy, that will continue, but in a simplistic form and with the ambitions of both partners to diversify from each other and to decrease mutual dependence. We will see some ad hoc selective cooperation on Iran, on the Middle East, and we will see some transnational engagement, mostly promoted. When it comes to the civil society, it is mostly promoted by the European Union. When it comes to business, it is mostly promoted by Russia, but challenged by Western sanctions. So that's the state of the relations that we have at the moment. Not very optimistic, but you know the trends, and in a way it's up to you as well to change EU-Russian relations. And with that, I finished the course on EU-Russian relations. Thank you for being with us, and look at our other classes.